What comes to mind when you hear the word gospel? Perhaps you think of its literal meaning from the Greek word euangelion, which means good news or glad tidings. Or maybe you think of the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are often called the Gospels or the Gospel accounts. Or maybe you think of the composite story from those accounts. Some would call that the gospel within the Gospels. Perhaps you think of Paul's definition in 1 Corinthians 15, where he defined the gospel as the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Some would even include the appearings and the ascension of Jesus as being part of this story of good news. But it might surprise you that this story of good news, which involves Jesus, was, according to Paul in Galatians 3 and verse 8, something preached to Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, God makes a promise to Abram to bless all the families of the earth through his seed. It is this promise that is the thread that ties the rest of the story of the Bible together. It is also a major turning point in the story of the Bible. The first major turning point, we would say, is the creation of the world. That God existed in eternity and at some point decided to create. That's turning point number one. But God created all things for his glory. And when man fell short of that glory and sinned, the story of the fall is another turning point in the story. It sends us off in the wrong direction. But now we get a real strong glimpse of what God is planning to do through this man Abraham by blessing all the families of the earth. This promise in Genesis chapter 12 is the thread that we're looking for. God said this in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1. God says to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, and go to a land that I will show you." Verse 2 says, "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." Verse 3, "I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Verse 4 then says, "So Abraham went." Now the text continues with God taking Abram to the land of Canaan. The Canaanites were still living there. But in verse 7, God says, "I will give all of this land to your descendants." And so we have the promise. It's a multifaceted promise, but we call it the promise. It is a promise of land. It is a promise to make a great nation out of Abraham's seed. It is a promise to bless him, to make him a blessing to others. It is a promise to even curse those who go contrary to him. The condition, however, is that he leave his father's household, that he leave his country. And the response is amazing. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 4 simply says, Abraham went. Now Thomas Cahill, in his book, The Gift of the Jews, argues that these two words, Abraham went, are the boldest in all of literature. I'd like to read something he wrote about those two words, Abram went. Cahill says, "They signal a complete departure from everything that has gone before in the long evolution of culture and sensibility. Out of summer comes a man who does not know where he is going, but goes forth into the unknown wilderness under the prompting of his God. Out of Mesopotamia, home of canny, self-serving merchants who use their gods to ensure prosperity and favor, comes a wealthy caravan with no material goal. Out of ancient humanity comes a party traveling by no known compass. Out of the human race comes a leader who says he has been given an impossible promise. Out of mortal imagination comes a dream of something new, something better, something yet to happen, something in the future." Now, if we break this down, Cahill mentions Abram does not know where he is going. And yet the important thing is he knows who's leading him. Cahill says he has no material goal. Now the beauty of that is our minds go to Hebrews 11 and verse 10, where we hear of Abram's great faith, of him going towards a city with foundations whose designer and builder is God. Cahill says He's traveling by no known compass. Yet we know he has a compass. Cahill also mentions he's been given an impossible promise. Now, from men's perspective, it truly is an impossible promise to promise a great nation out of a man who's 100 years old, whose wife has had no children. But Paul says in Romans chapter 4, verses 19 through 21, that Abram, considering his body to be practically dead and his wife's womb to be barren, did not waver at God's promise. Abram knew that God was able to deliver on that promise. He trusted that God was able to perform what had been asked of him. And so out of a 100-year-old man's loins come not one nation, but actually two. Isaac and Ishmael create two nations. But the promise goes to Isaac. Isaac passes that promise down to Jacob, whose name is later changed to Israel. Jacob has 12 sons, and those sons develop into families, and they develop into tribes, known as the 12 tribes of Israel. It would be through the tribe of Judah that would come the Christ. And so to Abraham was given this great promise that the Christ would come through his seed, and that through the Christ all the families of the earth would be blessed. That's good news. That is the gospel that was preached to Abram. We'll pick up on the story of Israel next time. Thanks for watching.